This man was poisoned 8 times, knocked down by a speeding vehicle, and left in the cold to die. And I mean that in the literal sense. Yet none of this killed him or brought him down. No matter what his enemies threw at him, the man, the myth, and the legend, Mike Malloy, just refused to die. This is the true life story of the best case of an immortal. During the 1910s, Irish immigration to the United States was at an all-time high, with nearly 5 million Irish people settling all over the country. It is believed that Mike came to the States during this time, taking on odd jobs such as janitor and factory worker. He had no family at all, and it's unclear if he ever dated or made friends. So as of now, he was completely alone. But that didn't matter much to him, because Mike fit the Irish stereotype of being a drunk perfectly. He was fired from multiple jobs because he would constantly drink, even when he was supposed to be working. But whenever he got fired, he would just find a job somewhere else so he could keep the money coming in and the booze flowing. There were tons of low-level jobs all over New York, which meant that no matter how many times he got fired, he could always find someone else willing to hire him. After all, Mike didn't care about making a lot of cash, which meant that he was happy with taking on hours of work for mere pennies just so he could get some more drink. Even when Prohibition started, Mike wasn't deterred and continued to frequent small speakeasies that still sold alcohol. All he wanted was alcohol, some food, and a place to sleep at night, and he would be happy till the end of his days as long as he had all 3 of those things. But in 1929, everything fell apart. The Great Depression hit, a time when companies struggled to pay even their best employees. Compared to them, what good is an Irish drunk who barely completes his work? Mike was one of the first people to be let go, and couldn't find work anywhere. He didn't have any savings either, so it wasn't long before he got kicked out of the apartment he was renting. So now, he was all alone, a poor Irishman who had no place to call home and barely any money to his name. Instead of trying to salvage the situation, Mike decided that he needed a drink first. So he went to the nearest bar and ordered one. Then he ordered another, and another after that, and kept ordering drinks until he had raised such a big tab that the owner came to him and asked him to pay for his drinks before ordering one more. Mike just grinned and told the owner that he had no money at all, at which point he was immediately kicked out of the establishment and back onto the streets. That was when a plan started to form in his mind. The thing is, as the Great Depression went on, more and more people turned to crime to make a living. The police could only do so much and had to focus all their energy on violent crime, which meant that a local drunk not paying his tab was something that would slip under the radar. And even if they actually arrested Mike, where would they even keep him? The cells were full of criminals already. Worst of all, Prohibition was still going on. This meant that even if the police had the time to arrest Mike and the space to hold him, the bar owner would be right there with him for committing the crime of selling alcohol illegally. All of this meant that Mike was virtually indestructible. He could just go into a bar, drink until he was full or until the bar owner had enough, get kicked out, and then just go to another bar. What's the worst that could happen? So Mike did just that. He spent the entirety of 1929 and 1930 bar hopping, barely scraping by and being drunk for most of his waking hours. It was around this time that he met his so-called best friend, Tony Marino. Marino was the owner of a speakeasy, and he was the nicest person around, according to Mike. When Mike entered Marino's bar and raised up a huge tab, instead of kicking him out, he gave Mike a job and paid him meager wages to take care of the bar. Eventually, when finances worsened, Marino was forced to let him go. But sometimes when Mike would come back, Marino would give him some free drinks as a show of good faith. On paper, he seems like a good friend. But if you asked anyone other than Mike, they'd tell you that Marino is the absolute worst person they know. Because Marino, along with 4 of his friends, would form a gang that ended up taking the lives of countless people and even made news for how horrible they were. Everything that Marino did for Mike wasn't out of the goodness of his heart. It was because Mike Malloy was their next target, and once he was dead, the entire gang would be extremely rich. But how did this work exactly? Why would a random drunk being killed make them rich? It all comes down to their plan. They would create life insurance policies in the name of people that they intended to kill, and would put themselves as the nominee, which is the person who receives all the money if the person whose life is insured ends up dying. From there, it was pretty easy to kill the person and make it look like an accidental death, and they even had a doctor who would make the death certificates to provide to the insurance firms. Once they provided all the necessary information to the firms, they would get the money, divide it between all 5 of them, and that would be enough to pay their bills for a few more months. When their money started to dry up, they would repeat this process again until they had enough funds to keep going. Their first victim was a woman called Mabel, who made the mistake of dating Marino. Mabel Carlson was born into a rich family, but due to constant arguments with her parents, she ended up running away. There, she met Marino, who befriended her, and eventually, the two started dating. She stayed with Marino at the bar and helped him with small chores to keep the bar neat and tidy. To her, Marino seemed like the perfect boyfriend, someone who never pushed her to do anything and kept her safe. So when Marino asked Mabel to sign a life insurance policy, she signed it without a second thought. A few months later, Marino fell on hard times, with almost no one coming to the bar. They didn't even have enough money for food, so to decrease the number of mouths he would have to feed and get some money to keep going for a few more months, Marino began his plan. He gave Mabel a glass of alcohol to drink, which had some sleeping pills mixed in. Once she was fully unconscious, he carried her to their bed, changed her into her nightwear, and then dumped buckets of cold water onto her. This was December, and outside it was freezing cold. So when Marino opened all the windows that Mabel's room had, the cool winter breeze drifted in, causing the already cold Mabel to get hypothermia, and eventually pass away in her sleep. He took the help of his 4 friends, Joseph Red Murphy, who was a bartender at Marino's speakeasy, Francis Pasqua, who was a gravedigger, as well as Hershey Green and Daniel Kreisberg to carry her body to the nearby cemetery, bury it, and then send all the necessary documents to the insurance company. This gave them a payout of around $2,000, which was just enough for the gang to pay their bills for 4 more months. Later on, this group of 5 friends would be dubbed the Murder Trust. Though for now, they slipped under the radar, and none of them got suspected of killing Mabel until years later, due to the fact that no one even knew that Mabel was living with Marino, and after she died, none of her family were even informed. All she had was her boyfriend, who killed her in cold blood. By the time Mike came into the picture, those 4 months were nearly finished. The gang needed someone they could kill off, and they needed him fast. And that's when Marino looked at his supposed friend, Mike Malloy, sitting in a corner of the bar, drinking himself to oblivion. If you needed a person who could be killed without arousing suspicion, someone who wouldn't be missed, then Mike was your perfect candidate. Considering how much he drank, it would be surprising if Mike didn't kill himself before the Murder Trust could even open a life insurance policy in his name. So, the gang moved fast, putting him down as Nicholas Malloy. They put his age as 45 years old and managed to convince the life insurance company that $3,000 or $80,000 in today's money would be a pretty good price for his life. From there, it was simple. They just gave Mike an unlimited tab, expecting that he would die naturally in a couple of days. A week went by, and Mike was far from dead. In fact, if you asked him, he would tell you that he was having the time of his life, and it was all thanks to his best friend, Tony Marino. The Murder Trust was losing a lot of money in the countless bottles that Mike would drink up in a day. It seemed like Mike had built up such a resistance to alcohol poisoning that no amount of drink would ever kill him. They needed a new plan. That's when they thought that if alcohol on its own wasn't poisonous enough, then they could easily add chemicals to it and finally closed the book on Mike Malloy's life. So, they added antifreeze, which is a chemical that is used to keep the engines of cars cool and is extremely poisonous to humans, even in small quantities. Within a few hours, it can affect your kidneys, lungs, brain, and nervous system. If you drink a shot filled with antifreeze, you'll die in less than a week without any treatment. The most horrifying part about antifreeze poisoning is that the symptoms are similar to alcohol poisoning, which meant that anyone who observed Mike from afar wouldn't be able to tell that something was wrong. All they needed to do was slip some antifreeze into his drink, and that would be it. When Mike drank the poisoned drink, the only thing he would have thought was that it was a bit sweeter than normal. Antifreeze tastes really sweet, which makes it tough to detect. But it was already in his system, and now there was nothing anyone could do. To make sure that Mike would die and not leave anything to chance, Marino poisoned all the bottles he gave Mike, which would be enough antifreeze to kill him 100 times over. But even after a couple of weeks, Mike was doing amazing. No matter how much poisoned alcohol he drank, he seemed no worse for the wear. He just kept drinking. It was like he was immune to the poison. It wasn't until a few decades later that it was realized that alcohol has a component that actively blocks the digestion of antifreeze into your body. This means that all the antifreeze that Mike ingested ended up going out of his body without being digested at all, which is the reason that he survived. But Marino didn't know this. By this point, Mike was becoming a bigger problem than any of them had thought. This was meant to be an easy job. Just give the old dude some alcohol and he'd die. But that wasn't the case. They started to use other chemicals in the hopes that they would have some effect. They started off by using turpentine, which is used in soap and also used to make a special oil. In large quantities, turpentine is extremely harmful to humans and leads to a really painful death. But more time passed and there was absolutely no effect. From there, they went to horse liniment. Liniment is basically a category of lotions, balms, and other special objects that are rubbed on the skin to remove muscle pain. Horse liniment specifically is used primarily for horses to make sure they stay active and in good health. There were rumors that horse liniment is extremely toxic to humans, so the gang decided to put some of it in Mike's alcohol. But like everything that came before it, there was absolutely no effect. Mike was still drinking a lot and was still enjoying his life, much to the dismay of 5 selfish people. By this point, they were getting tired, so they started getting more serious. They used rat poison. And back then, the rat poison was really potent and unregulated, unlike now where the mixture isn't that strong so as to not mistakenly lead to human deaths. Yet, just as you guessed it, the rat poison had no effect on Mike. By this point, Mike was starting to have a reputation in the neighborhood for being the biggest drunk on the planet, which was a problem. The more that people knew about Mike, the more suspicious his death would become. The murder trust was running out of time. They decided that alcohol was not the way to go and began to give him poisoned food. They gave Malloy raw oysters soaked in wood alcohol, the idea apparently coming from Pasqua, who claimed he saw a man die after eating oysters with whiskey. When even that had no effect, a sandwich of spoiled sardines mixed with poison and carpet tacks was tried. By now, Mike had ingested around 7 different types of poisons in a short period, so there was some effect on his body. He was getting slower, he had slurred speech, and overall, he just wasn't much to look at. Or maybe that was just the alcohol and none of the poisons had any effect on him. But either way, the murder trust gave up on killing him with poison. They needed the money fast, so they went with the good old method of freezing him to death. Unlike how it was with Mabel, they didn't need to use any sleeping pills on Mike. He did the job himself by just drinking until he passed out. Once he was unconscious, they carried him outside, dumped him in the snow, and poured 5 gallons of water all over his bare chest. Normally, this would be more than enough to kill someone from hypothermia, but Mike's luck wasn't ending just yet. Just an hour after he was dumped outside, police noticed the strange man lying in the snow, took him to a homeless shelter, and reclothed him, ultimately saving his life. The next day, he was back at Marino's bar, asking for a drink. Now, if you had tried to kill a man in 8 different ways and he told you that you're an amazing friend who always helps him out, most people would give up. But by this point, Marino and the others were too deep into this. They didn't have enough time to find a new target. And even if they let Mike go, all the money they lost giving him unlimited alcohol needed to be recovered somehow. And it's not like they could just go back to normal. Cutting his unlimited tab now would be extremely suspicious. And Marino couldn't just cut ties with Mike without any warning. All of this would bring unneeded attention to their group, especially since Mike had a reputation by this point. So, they needed to get rid of him fast. The poison didn't work, and freezing him to death didn't work either, so they decided to stop being so subtle and just do him in as quickly as possible. One of the men in the group, Hershey Green, was a taxi driver. Car accidents happen all the time, especially when alcohol is involved. So, if an old Irish drunk was run over in the dead of night, no one would suspect a thing. So, on one fateful day, when Mike was completely drunk, Marino led him out onto the street. As Mike tried to cross the street, Green used his taxi to hit him head on, traveling at the speed of 42 miles per hour, or 72 kilometers per hour. Mike went down and stopped moving. It's safe to say that the gang was extremely happy and immediately got to work trying to get the insurance policy taken out. But this was late into the Great Depression, and insurance scams like this one were commonplace, which meant that more and more people were getting denied their claims. The group didn't have any death certificate or proof that Mike was actually dead, so they weren't able to get the money they so desperately needed. So the gang ended up just wasting time and money, all efforts wasted. A month went by, and they had made no breakthrough. They were all sitting in the bar when suddenly, like a ghost, Mike Malloy walked through the doors. It turns out that he was still alive and was just in the hospital for his 3 broken bones. And of course, the first thing he did was ask for a drink. That meant that it wasn't over just yet. They still had one more chance to either give up and let Mike Malloy live to die of natural causes, or try to kill him in the hopes that the insurance company changes their minds. Considering that they were later nicknamed the Murder Trust when this story came to light, it's safe to say that the group took the second option. Around this time, one of the most common methods of suicide was by using coal gas. Coal gas is mostly made up of stuff like carbon monoxide, which can displace all the oxygen out of your system, leading to asphyxiation, which is death due to lack of oxygen. It was not uncommon to hear about people putting their heads in coal gas ovens and turning them on as a way to end their lives, especially during the Great Depression. And who better to end his life than a poor Irish drunk who had no family and nowhere to go? So, on February 22nd, 1933, after he had passed out from another drunken spree for the night, the murderers took Malloy to Murphy's room, put a hose in his mouth that was connected to the coal gas jet, and turned it on. This finally killed Malloy, with his death occurring within an hour. He was pronounced dead of lobar pneumonia by Dr. Frank Manzella, who was paid handsomely for his service. This finally gave the group enough evidence to show the insurance claim, and they got their money. Mike Malloy, the unkillable, finally died. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, the report came that a certain Michael Malloy had been killed. The police had heard of Iron Mike and his reputation of being able to drink huge amounts of alcohol without any problem. There were no signs suggesting that he was suicidal, and considering his reputation, it was unlikely that he died of alcohol poisoning. So, they had the body exhumed and forensically examined until they found traces of coal gas in his system. From there, it was easy to track down Marino since he spent so much time with Mike. Once they had Marino, they also brought in the other 4 members of the Murder Trust. as well as Dr. Manzella for signing the death certificate. This led to a trial where Marino, Pasqua, Murphy, and Kreisberg were all given the death sentence, and Green was given a life sentence. Kreisberg, Marino, and Pasqua were given the electric chair on June 7, 1934, with Murphy joining them on July 5th of the same year. Dr. Manzella didn't get convicted by the end of the trial, but he did have to pay a hefty fine on the charge of failing to report a suspicious death to the police and medical examiner. Mike Malloy may have died physically that day, but he continues to live with us even today. His story has been talked about multiple times, being given titles such as Mike the Durable, Iron Mike, and even the Rasputin of New York.